Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining. I know others will be joining shortly, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to this webinar on switching gears, enabling access to sustainable urban mobility. My name is Brian Dean. I'm a head of energy efficiency at Sustainable Energy for All. This webinar will take about an hour. We hope that we'll be able to present the findings in about 40 minutes. We'll have about 20 minutes at the end for questions and answers. Throughout the webinar, feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom. Otherwise, you can also feel free to email us after the webinar at efficiency@SEforALL.org. I'm actually quite excited. This is a new interesting report that looks at the opportunity for secondary cities to shift to sustainable mobility and really doing that before, as we've seen in many megacities, transport and energy can be quite suffocating for a city. So this report looks at answering that problem before it ever even becomes a problem. I've got with me the co-authors of the report, Clotilde Rossi-Deschio here with me in Vienna, and Tali Trigg online with us from Italy. And they will be guiding us through the slides, and they'll be bringing us through the key findings from this report. Okay, so with that, I'll start off with a few of the introductory slides before I hand it off to Clotilde and Tali. So first of all, of course, what we see is that transport affects the quality of life, and having access to sustainable mobility is a prerequisite for achieving many of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Here you'll see we've highlighted about 11 of the key Sustainable Development Goals in relation to transport, and you know, each of these are really, each of the SDGs are affected by transport and energy, but these are the 11 key ones that we see in terms of the nexus between the two. I'll go into a little bit more detail on these in the coming two slides. So for this energy and transport nexus and the SDGs, the first one is poverty. And of course, what we see is that sustainable mobility is critical to populations' ability to have economic gains in their life. Of course, their ability to get to work, get to school, and you know, have a good quality life to pull them out of poverty. So really, we see that sustainable mobility is something that can really level out the benefits across the population types. Second is on food, and of course food has a double angle on this. One is the ability for food to reach the markets, and then of course the ability for us to get to those markets to get access to healthy quality food. And so we see sustainable mobility is key for both sides of the food chain, basically. Next, for SDG 3, there's actually two key components here. One is on air quality and one is on road safety. And of course, we know from the World Health Organization that there are a significant number of premature deaths globally due to air quality, and about 385,000 people died in 2015 due to you know, premature deaths due to vehicle exhaust emissions. So this is a particularly large reason for wanting to have sustainable mobility. Road safety is the other, of course, and where we have safe roadways, safe places for people to walk, safe crossings, possibly less vehicles on the road, we have a significant increase in the ability to reduce you know, accidents and deaths associated with poor road conditions and poor mobility conditions. Sustainable Development Goal 4 on education, there's an interesting link here because with both children and teachers, there's a predictable pattern for them in terms of getting from home to the school. And this offers the ability to actually plan ahead of time at the city level to make sure that the population is moving from their homes to the school and doing that in a sustainable way. So there's really the ability to use a known pattern to do better urban planning. For Sustainable Development Goal 5, we see that for gender, there's a, oftentimes planning is not necessarily done equally across the gender bias. And what we see is there's a need for recognizing trips made while caring for others, and really as a distinct category. And so that could be women as the head of the household and doing trips, or possibly taking care of children, or even other generations of the family. So we see that there's an important part of the planning process to make sure that this is recognized as a category for the planning. So for Sustainable Development Goal 6, on the water side, we see that sustainable transport has the ability to affect both the ability to have clean water, but also to receive clean water. And there's the ability for water to be clean and not dirty from fossil fuels, or possibly even poor air quality. The water quality itself can improve by better planning of the energy and transport nexus. This one is a little bit lighter than some of the other ones, but it's particularly important to make sure that we're addressing clean water issues given the future concerns on this side, with the scarce amount of water, clean water that is available. Number 9, for infrastructure, both transport and energy infrastructures, again, thinking about the two, having them used and shared by everyone, essentially making sure that the infrastructure is set up for all income groups, for the community as a whole, and making sure that the planning for the two is done in tandem as opposed to completely separate. And this can improve property values across the city, but also improve the efficiency of both systems as well. For SDG 10, on social equity, we see that obviously universal access to sustainable energy is necessary for a just transition, and then providing and enabling access to sustainable urban mobility would increase the overall accessibility for all of us, and really enabling equitable conditions across our populations. And finally, in SDG 11, we see that digitalization, particularly the digital solutions that are now being made for energy and transport sectors can be developed in a way to support base of the pyramid, those in poverty, to leapfrog to more effective, efficient solutions. This could include using digital mapping tools to enable us to find where a bus is and when it's going to arrive, so that we can better plan our day and get from point A to point B. So these are the reasons why we see it's important for Sustainable Energy for All to look at this energy and transport nexus. But the next step is, have we been asking the right questions? And I'm going to turn it over to Clotilde here to guide us through this next part of, have we been asking the right questions?
Thank you, Brian. Yes, indeed. So have we been asking the right questions? So have we been connecting energy and transport in the most meaningful way, and has efficiency been addressed also correctly in order to achieve the highest synergies between the energy and transport sector? So we think that the best question, or a better question, could be to ask when along the service value chain can a solution be applied to achieve the highest results. And to this we refer to the well-known, at least in the transport sector, avoid, shift, improve framework. This is a framework that addresses efficiency throughout a transport system. So on a system level efficiency, which is the avoid, trip level efficiency on the shift, and improve, which is the vehicle efficiency. So an avoid is basically any trip not taken or any reduction of trips is per se an improve in efficiency. For example, this could be addressed through integration of land use and transport planning. The shift, so in the trip efficiency, could be that the utilization of a more efficient mode of transportation, as it, for example, walking or biking when possible, or taking public transportation instead of using a single person car. And improve is acting at the vehicle level, so utilizing a more efficient vehicle, a more energy efficient car, for instance. So we will hear more about this and how this can be applied when we will speak about solution, but it's something that we felt needs to be considered from the onset, as avoid in particular and shift also are two aspects that has not been exploited as they could. So we have been focusing on fast-growing cities, on secondary cities, as anticipated by Brian, as these cities, so the fast-growing cities in developing countries present an opportunity to act now, so that we can avoid an efficient growth, and both sectors of energy and transport can be addressed. So we have used a number of parameters to filter the city that should have highest priorities. And the parameters are indicated in the slide. So the populations between 300,000 and 1 million inhabitants as of today, with a high growth expected of an average of about 50% in the next 10 years, so 2020 to 2030. And we have excluded locations where there is less than 5% of population at the base of the pyramid, also conflict areas, and cities with bad governance. So applying these filters, we have identified 19 countries and a total list of 260 cities. So the country list is diverse, is across 3 different continents. India has a prominent role, as 121 of the 200 cities are indeed in India. Other countries are, so the continent which has the highest countries is Africa, with 13 countries. In Asia, other countries are Indonesia, Nepal, and the Philippines, while in Latin America, the countries covered are Bolivia and Honduras. So we have divided these cities in 4 different city types that will be presented here based on a set of indicators, and that present a common list of characteristics that would allow these cities to be more easily targeted with some specific solutions. So the first city type are efficiency opportunists. The indicators that we have utilized to filter the cities are the average yearly growth rate, the energy intensity, energy consumption of transport specifically, and also whether there is a fuel economy policy in place or not. So in the map here, you see the top 20 cities, so the cities that fulfill this criteria with the highest ranking. So 19 of these cities are in India, as it's probably no surprise that most of the fast-growing secondary cities are now in India, and 1 city in Nigeria. So as these are the fast-growing cities for the next 10 years, there is an opportunity to act now on their mobility needs. there is an opportunity to work on energy efficiency. And we see this, there is already some advantage for the cities that have economy policy in place. The second city type, we call them digital disruptors. So we utilize as indicators the mobile cellular subscriptions. So what is the percentage of the population connected through their cellular phone, and they can have access to data through them. What is the level of air pollution, and also what is the mortality caused by road traffic. So these cities can utilize their digital connectivity and digital technology as a solution to have access to sustainable mobility, and are also the cities that could profit most in terms of co-benefits, mostly air pollution and also safety through the increased safe mobility. So this group is the most diverse, so it's also shown in the 20 cities. It has a very strong representation in Africa, and also one city in Nepal. The third group, city group, are the electric vehicle leapfroggers. So the indicators we utilized here is the population exposed again to air pollution, but also what is the urban access to electricity, the quality of road, and also what is the renewable energy as utilized in electricity. So these cities the cities that can first be utilizing vehicle electrification, as they have already a higher percentage and utilization of renewable energy in their grids. They could so immediately profit from that, and also they would have the secondary benefit, a co-benefit of improved air quality. We have factored in also the quality of roads, as this is something that it helps in terms of electric vehicles deployment, as electric vehicles can work good with if the quality of the roads is also a good one. On the fourth group are the renewable drivers. So in the indicators, we use all possible indicators that really relate to renewable energy in its broader term, and the CO2 emission from transport. So beyond the emissions, we use the use of renewable electricity, the use of renewable energy in transport, and also the use of renewable energy as a whole. So these cities are the one where renewable resources are available. To define this, so we looked at all renewable energy as present, so not only electricity, but also the use of biofuels, and also how much of energy is already used in transport directly. And this is a group where that could utilize renewable energy in their mobility. And all the cities of this group are in Africa. The top 20 cities of this group are in Africa. So now that we have identified this city type, I would ask Tali to go ahead and present the solutions.
Sure. Thank you, Clotilde, and thank you everyone for joining today. So Brian gave a good overview about why these issues matter and what this Nexus is really about, what it tries to enable. And Clotilde gave a very good overview of where we've been looking, where the biggest gaps are to access to sustainable urban mobility. So now we'd like to get into, let's say, the what, as in what solutions have we looked at then. The two things three quick things to mention at the outset. One is energy and transport and the Nexus have been talked about a lot, but the research we've done and the work we've done really shows that not much has been achieved in terms of on-the-ground synergies between energy and transport. So it's to date something that's largely untapped benefit. So it's really something that needs to be planned jointly, executed jointly, in order to see the benefits in tandem. The second thing to mention is that we're using the Avoid, Shift, Improve framework to a degree mentioned previously, but of course we're thinking pragmatically, so that when we're looking at the context of these cities that we looked at, we don't simply transplant things that may have worked, be it cycling in Denmark or buses in Bogota or Tesla electric vehicles and so on, but rather trying to take into account things that are realistic, but still being ambitious. And the final thing to mention is that these three solutions none of them stand alone. They need to work together to be efficient. Taking, let's say, electric mobility as an example, if all the cars in Johannesburg suddenly go electric, we've moved from a traffic jam to a green traffic jam, and we've solved perhaps some issues or centralized some issues, but we really haven't tapped into the full potential. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through these three examples. If we go to the next slide, you can see here, just to get an idea of which cities fit into which solutions. As you may be able to guess, a lot of the cities and data is quite hard to get, and that's something that we try to map out what there is and also what there isn't, being honest about it's very hard to find a lot of data in a lot of these smaller cities, although spatial data seems to be more and more available. And so we wanted to understand which solutions work in which cities. And you can see here for solution one, for example, these two types of cities, efficiency opportunists and renewable drivers. Solution two, looking at demand side targeting and management. And then for electric mobility, unsurprisingly, EV leapfroggers, as we call them, or cities that are characterized in this report as having at least the potential or a few things that are working for them. Things don't always follow, let's say, a logical sequence. A city that may not have seemed like having an opportunity goes for it, another doesn't. But this is the data has pointed us to show a lot of interesting opportunities across the world. So if we move to the first solution, we can get a little more concrete here and also show you some examples to exemplify, maybe not a perfect application all the time, but really an interesting indication of what can be done. So as mentioned, integrating land use and mobility planning is something that has been considered, and you probably have heard of things like transit-oriented development. Land use and transport planning are often considered together, but public transport planning may not be included. Mobility, especially non-motorized, such as walking and cycling. So this is something that has been thought about, and although we haven't seen as much progress as we'd like, but there is more momentum nowadays. So we wanted to add the energy sector as a filter or a theme as well to this, to see what can be done if we think about it all together. So that's something we did in the report, and found that integrating energy planning along with transport and land use planning would increase the deployment of renewable energy along with electric vehicles, as well as improve demand side management. Some of the planning options include to address the massive informal mobility sector. So we tried to keep an open mind that the informal sector is something that needs to be taken into account. It provides a mobility service, but it arguably not always an efficient mobility service, but it's the best available right now. So we wanted to understand how can this be made more efficient, but in a realistic way. Another option looks at planning on the planning level. So a lot of cities have sustainable, or are now developing sustainable urban mobility plans, or even on a national level. And again, these plans are a bit what you make of them. So if you integrate well mobility, then as well as land use planning, then you can really get urban efficiency. People can really get to where they need to at the shortest distances possible. But if we include energy as well, then we can leverage it even further. And I'll show you some examples now of that. Next slide. So in a public and informal transportation mode, we'll go into a case study next slide, but for now, one idea is to look at payment systems. And what we're seeing in South Africa and Kenya are using mapping technologies and easy to use and safe digital payment platforms have enabled access to mobility. I think we all know that taking buses, for example, and switching buses is something you tend to do if you know that the payment can be used on different types of lines, different operators or authorities. But that's something that needs to be made easy and reliable. And that's something that is happening in South Africa and Kenya in some examples. Walking and cycling in Quelimane, Mozambique, I believe the 4th largest city, the bicycling has gained increasing popularity, and it's thanks to a variety of factors, but it's nice to point out one here, which is that the mayor cycles himself. And again, it's just an example, but it points to the importance of having champions who walk the walk or cycle the cycle, but actually show what's possible even at the highest level. If you look at Uruguay, there's an interesting example there with an e-NUMP being developed, as in a national urban mobility plan, which integrates electric mobility into all planning. And that's quite interesting because it's in a way, it's a national impetus for all the towns and cities of Uruguay to at least consider electric mobility when they are doing planning. So that doesn't necessarily mean every town and city has to go electric or only purchase electric buses immediately, but it at least means that when they're doing planning, they need to consider it. So that, for example, if there's a town that's on a coastal route with a highway, it might make sense to consider charging stations there for visitors or people, drivers who are passing through, or bus routes, and so on and so forth. So again, it's a small step, but it's important because it really can save a lot of time and money than doing it later on. India has a lot of experience with its national urban transport policy. Colombia also has a multi-tier public transport system depending on city size, which uses criteria which are established at a national level. So this just points again at, from a planning point of view, there's a lot of more momentum now for these national and urban plans. And in themselves, they may not amount to much, but if they're done rightly and they leverage the right kind of actors and infrastructure, we can see a lot of positive effects, as we've seen in these countries. Next slide. So one nice example comes from a municipality in South Africa, which we're looking at minibuses here. And again, that is arguably largely overlooked when we talk about sustainable transport, the role of minibuses, but they play a very, very important integral part all over the world. And there's different things that can be done with minibuses. They could be electrified, they could be planned better. One thing that was done here is that something akin to TripAdvisor was used, whereby passengers could rate taxis and minibus taxis on how they were driving, but not just how they were driving, whether or not what the cars were like. And this was actually part of an overall sustainability plan. So again, separately, it might not have led to much, but because they wanted to push for more efficient vehicles, cleaner vehicles, and more sustainable urban mobility, basically, this was a really interesting way to do it, which it uses digitalization, but it's a buzzword. What does it really mean? And here's one rather on the ground example of what can be done. Next slide. So solution one looks again at the planning level of things. Solution two, which is very much linked, looks at demand side management and targeting, by which we mostly mean mapping in this sense. And the whole idea is to understand what is the demand for energy and transport. In transport and energy, we often talk about them as being derived demands. You don't want droplets of oil or electrons per se, but you want the services provided. So then the question is, well, what is it you're seeking to do? If you're going to, as Brian mentioned, if you're trying to get to school, then what's the best way to get to school? And of course, when you're doing planning, you can see what the clusters are and how people are traveling. And by having this kind of data to help, which is more and more available, you can make more efficient decisions from an urban planning point of view. Professor Luis Betancourt in Chicago says I believe he said that the urban scale is now available, meaning that we have the spatial data is or can be made available at a very detailed level to better do planning that's more efficient, that integrates, again, mobility, land use, and energy. An interesting example of this, which again, it's a niche example, but it's kind of nice, is the use of drones. This is something that's done in Malawi or Vanuatu. And again, you know, it's a fancy technological solution, but what's nice about it is it just illustrates the point that instead of coming from a remote village to the big city to get a vaccine, could it be that the most efficient way to get the vaccine is actually by having a centralized place for cooling vaccines or cooling medicine, and then using drones to take them to villages on an occasional basis. Or put differently, you could use off-grid solar to make sure that cooling is done off-site. And so transport here it's a secondary effect, I guess you could say, but it's something that usually hasn't been thought about together, and it's worth really, as Clotilde mentioned, are we asking the right questions here? Next slide. You've probably seen some similar maps like this, but this just to give an indication of the potential of spatial mapping. On the left here, this is in Nairobi. You can see share of jobs accessible within an hour by car. Perhaps unsurprisingly, to those who've been to Nairobi, you can see that more shares of jobs are accessible. So from a planning perspective, the idea is to try to, this alone is interesting, but if we take it further, this can be used in a really interesting way for better mobility, land use, and energy planning to make sure that the opportunities such as jobs and overall whatever opportunities that mobility enables, especially for women, are something that are considered, and we believe spatial tools and demand side, call it targeting if you want, or a better understanding of what the demand is and where the demand is and when, is something that can help planning more efficient cities. Next slide. So some examples of where that's been done in Zimbabwe, a South African company, along with another organization, have looked at informal public transport and formal public transport to flag issues in terms of anything from, let's say, the roads are no longer clear, or, you know, this is rain has washed away this road, or this bus doesn't run anymore. And so it's trying to provide improved mobility for informal settlements, for example. And so when we're talking about sustainable mobility, of course, we recognize that a lot of places and people don't have access to any type of mobility, except for perhaps walking. But this is one tool that can be used with the others to make sure that overall it leads to sustainable urban mobility. Another interesting example is an organization in Chicago, which has built a mapping tool of the United States for housing and transport. And again, the application here for other cities is that this kind of information could be mapped out to help people plan on an individual level where to, let's say, rent or buy housing when it comes to work. Similar concept is that of energy burden, to better understand, possibly on an individual level, but also on a macro level, to plan what are better metrics to measure affordability and how do we plan accordingly. So this opens up very interesting opportunities. As it says here, how can public transport infrastructure investment reduce energy cost burden for the base of the pyramid? So in a way, it might sound like it's putting a lot of things together, and of course it is. But the overall point here is that the first step is to try to get some of this data, a lot of which is and can be made available, but also not to make perfect the enemy of the good. There are ways to improve even informal transport today and make it more efficient. Next slide. Finally, we turn to electric mobility. This is looking at, again, well, in one way it's looking at efficiency on a vehicle level, but we wanted to look at what role electric mobility writ large can play in this context. And we found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that electric two-wheelers and electric minibuses have been, in Sub-Saharan Africa especially, largely overlooked, but they could yield substantial efficiency benefits and enable sustainable urban mobility when powered by renewable electricity. So those are two modes we try to look at a little closer instead of only looking at, for example, electric cars. Of course, thinking about these two together is really where we think there's a lot of potential. So there's a lot of places where, sure, there's energy, there's rolling blackouts, or there's maybe just a lack of electricity. So then, of course, this may not make sense. But then on the other side, it may not make sense to invest in renewable energy unless, of course, there is higher use, for example, by vehicles. So it's something that looking at together, which may make special sense for fleets. And by using fleets and shared mobility and public transportation, this provides access to electric and clean vehicles sooner to the base of the pyramid populations. Next slide. Just two quick points about India and China, just that this is not a new idea, and this is something that already exists, but it hasn't really received a lot of policy attention in other countries. And it's worth really looking at what the experiences learned are from India and China, especially for things like efficiency, recycling, charging patterns, and lifetime of batteries and vehicles. Next slide. But if we turn to Sub-Saharan Africa, where most of the countries were that we targeted or looked at, or where the data led us rather, 3 countries we saw are already doing things on electric two-wheelers. One is Namibia, where local companies producing solar-powered electric two-wheelers. And there's over 100 so-called sun cycles on the road. Again, it's one example, but it's something to showcase that this is already happening, and it's worth considering where it makes sense and where the benefits are the greatest. In Rwanda, an electric bike company is looking at fleets, and so far the prices look quite good. Clotilde will talk a little bit more about financing, but one of the obvious things to point out right now is that the timing of this report and the timing of this kind of thinking is really, it's propitious, it's good timing because, of course, electric vehicle prices are coming down, solar PV prices are coming down, and we're also seeing more and more use of spatial tools, digitalization. We're even seeing secondhand electric vehicles coming into markets in Africa and the Middle East, for example. And so it's good timing to consider all of this. No one of these things will solve all the issues, but thinking about them together, we think can lead to overall efficiency. And then finally in Kenya, there's a company, a Swedish company working with a Kenyan company doing retrofits, which again is a small niche, perhaps application, retrofitting vehicles, making them electric. But they're also cooperating with a delivery firm to produce fully electric motorbikes or bikes. And so sometimes the idea is that putting these things together, one company that does retrofits might be able to produce fully electric vehicles, of course, or do things like battery maintenance or recycling and so on. Yes, next slide. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Clotilde, but just to very quickly summarize again, solution 1 looks at on the planning side of things. It's not a very, how do I put it? It's not a solution you might see in the news because it's not a quick fix technology solution, but it is something that relates to institutional capacity building. It relates to working across silos, and we think the benefits could be huge at an urban level. The second solution looks at spatial tools and mapping, and really just answering the question of where is the demand and what is it for, and trying to understand the demand side much better. So far, demand side thinking is more and more in the transport and energy sector, certainly not a majority, but we haven't seen much demand side thinking when it comes to putting energy and transport together. So that's something we wanted to present here, what a possible solution is. And then finally, electric mobility. We're all familiar with it to various degrees, but we wanted to see what could make sense in the cities that we've profiled here. So thank you so much for my side. Over to you, Clotilde.
Thank you, Tali. Yeah, so on finance, what we have found is that cities have received just 11% of multilateral climate finance for mobility projects. So this number is particularly low, even though there is an overarching issue on how accessible is climate finance overall. There is definitely a particular issue in case of the cities that we're targeting, which are secondary, are small. They most probably don't have any credit history. And so these are very particular, difficult targets for projects to be bankable. So while we have seen some efforts in cities to be grouped together to be more easy to allow them access to credit and to finance, this is something that has happened only in very specific cluster and situations. So there is definitely an opportunity here to evaluate and to look into different business models and different financing models so that these cities and secondary cities can have easier access to finance. There is also another topic related to transport and who has the jurisdiction over planning and over the definition of the specific projects. So we see an opportunity in the linking national urban mobility plans, national determined contributions, and the Sustainable Development Goals action plans to urban, to allow the link between the urban and the national level. So that local officials can really develop projects that can happen and can be bankable through institutions. So as was already mentioned, we still have a positive news, so the time is right. So in terms of several technology, many of the sustainable technology, here we have a few examples, are now cost competitive or even less costly than their alternative unsustainable alternatives. So here we have the total cost of ownership comparison between the e-bus and the diesel bus or CNG bus. And we see that the cost of operation is indeed the same or lower. Off-grid solar penetration is growing in several countries, and in particular here, many of the countries we have already identified as priority, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, and India have already a share, which is a sizable share of their market in terms of off-grid solar systems, and it's growing. And the next. A trend that has been it's well known, has been seen. So battery prices has been dropped drastically in the next 10 years. There is no, this trend is ongoing, so it's still happening. So, and this battery price increase in efficiency and also price decrease is something that definitely will help in terms of the deployment of sustainable solutions. So going towards the end of the presentation, so we have recommendations and steps. On the recommendations, we aim for a focus on more efficient modes of transportation that can be applied to base of the pyramid population. In particular public transit, but also allowing for more walking and cycling. And this could be made also through appropriate land use and the adequate pricing of car utilization. Should identify and foster champions, as for example the mayor from Quilimane, Mozambique, who is biking. So these persons are very important to allow for the cultural shift which is necessary. Create alliance between partners, and here we see a special focus on having practitioners, ministers from both the energy and mobility sectors work together. And achieve multiple SDGs when considering solutions for both energy and mobility. On the next steps, improve the availability of data and metrics so that we can both evaluate the needs and the effects of the solution that applied, address the policy gaps, increase capacity building and spatial planning for government, since so there is an opportunity to gather and harvest more spatial planning data. And having this data available can really maximize the synergies when planning for together energy and transport infrastructure, and facilitate and enable investments in both renewable energy, in both sustainable and energy and transport. So with this, so we are ending our presentation. We would like to extend our thank you, but to our funders and supporters, and a particular thank you to the German government, the BNZ, who has supported this initiative. And we would like to let you know that we have our global forum in Kigali in Rwanda that will happen at the end of May. So join us, and registration is open now on our homepage. So we'll wait you then in Rwanda. So thank you, and I will give the word to Brian for the Q&A session.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for all that have put in the questions already in the system. Feel free to continue to do that. And we'll go back and forth between the team here to try to answer some of the questions that are already in there. So Clotilde, I wonder if you can maybe answer the question about why the particular cities were selected that we selected, and you know, what the criteria was for that.
Yes, so we have based our selection on the data that we were able to harvest, and we have created, we have picked on the specific data sets so that we could really group the cities in a meaningful way. So by that, we have to say that finding data for cities that are secondary cities and that are in developing countries has been a challenge. So we have used data that were available from the World Bank database, from Sustainable Mobility for All. We have worked with the official SDGs 7 tracking report in terms of energy data, and some of the data were available only at country level, so we extended them at the city level when city level data were not available. And in terms of grouping, so we wanted to create city types in a way that we could address different cities, maybe for two reasons, so that we could link a specific solution to a specific city type, and also to allow also for other cities that have similar characteristics. For example, they know they have a very high penetration of cellular phones, they have issues with their air quality, that they can already see of the cities, and they can look at what solution can be best applied to the specific city.
Okay, great. Tali, I wonder if you could answer the questions about how do metro systems compare to bus systems, and then how do electric rickshaws compare to CNG rickshaws, and recognizing the current shift that's been happening in India?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so for metro systems comparing with bus systems, in the context of cities less than 1 million, it would be, how do I put it? Expensive is the short answer there. So per kilometer, quite expensive. It is something you see some cities go for, nevertheless. There's things like geography and topography that play into that. So sometimes it can make more sense. You might see in places like Medellin, Colombia, where cable cars, or La Paz, Bolivia, where that makes more sense. So I would say from one, just simply looking at a metric of dollars per kilometer, it doesn't make a lot of sense, especially when we have increasingly better planned bus systems, such as bus rapid transit. But that's not to say that never makes sense in cities less than 1 million, just like cable cars might make sense in some contexts, but not all. The second question was, all right, CNG rickshaws versus electric rickshaws. I think that's a really good point, that it's really important that governments and cities set at least, or support some sort of long-term thinking and long-term signals, so that as you rightly point out, that there's not too many shifts or too many disruptions for people working in transport and mobility who are making investments in CNG infrastructure and then suddenly have to change. So that sort of understanding of policies that remain is really important. How do they address? Again, from a emissions point of view, electric are usually cleaner, but again, depends on the grid mix. So it really depends. We would have to look at the different cities, which we have, but a lot of times they make sense. Then there's also a matter of infrastructure. Is there gas available? And also, what's the best use of gas? So that's something that can be considered more on a macro and a national level. So it's a short answer, but it's a very good question because there's a lot in there.
Great, thanks, Tali. Clotilde, I wonder if you can answer the question about, are there any behavioral aspects to sustainable mobility that you think are worthwhile considering in the planning process?
Thank you. Yes, indeed. So there are many aspects, and many of them will be looked more in details also when we think more of the applicability of the solutions. But one which is worthwhile mentioning is really the importance of having champions and having examples that are set so that a new behavior as an increased share of biking, for example, but this could be the same also related to other modes. So the utilization of public transport system, for example, is something that can be pointed out and can be utilized for further foster this shift in mentality that is very much needed.
Okay, great. Tali, I've got a few related questions for you. What tools, or are there toolkits and things that would allow decision makers, and particularly, a question on, for Benin, what would it take for them to actually achieve sustainable urban mobility? So are there tools, are there approaches that should be used that are readily available?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, very good question. I think for Benin, we did have one, let me see, one city, Abomey Calavi, or one agglomeration, where we saw it as a digital disruptor, meaning again that it had the kind of profile that might allow for digitalization to be a really good tool to move forward on sustainable urban mobility. But yeah, broadly speaking, there's a plethora of tools available. From a planning point of view, there's a lot of sustainable urban mobility plans, a lot of planning tools, transit-oriented development planning and guides. These can also be used partly as guides to follow, but also there are tools to estimate impacts as well. And related to that, I mentioned some spatial tools that are available, not only in Europe or United States, but also Sub-Saharan Africa, all over the world now. And these spatial tools, as the question was, does allow decision makers to evaluate alternate technical solutions. So not only, let's say, starting with a technology solution, EV versus hydrogen or something like that, but actually asking whether or not the vehicle is needed in the first place and what type of vehicle, and then trying to understand what type of fuel it might run on. So there's plenty of toolkits. For example, Global Fuel Economy Initiative has a lot of tools on understanding how fuel economy policies would impact. There's also plenty of calculators for understanding emissions from EVs, depending on your grid mix, both today, but also projected. And then you can really do, make a good, let's say, a more informed decision.
Great, thanks, Tali. I've actually got a related question I want to throw on top of that, which is, have you seen examples of fully integrated energy decarbonization and sustainable mobility plans? Have we seen some examples of bringing those two together?
Yeah, I think I saw a question here from Sheila Watson on that. Yeah, there's good momentum now, and there's a good opportunity because of NDCs, National Determined Contributions, as well as SDG action plans. So there's really momentum to tie together fully decarbonization plans along with transport. So we've seen that in some places like Thailand, for example, has strongly integrated transport into its NDCs over time, more and more. It's something that often is always, we always say it doesn't go away, but it's neither high nor low priority, and that's often the fate of the transport sector. But I think when we look at emissions, it's simply inescapable, and if we really are serious about addressing it, we need to link it better to other sectors. So that's on a national level. I mentioned the electric national urban mobility plan in Uruguay. That's something that I think is a really nice example and something that's in development right now. And then finally, on a smaller scale, what we've seen in, for example, Kenya, is that when they were planning some schools and hospitals, and they started thinking about energy distribution and how persons were going to get there, they realized that actually a lot of times it might make sense to not to build a school in a different place near off-grid solar, because then at least you know you're going to have energy powering the hospital and the school, and sometimes this can also help with the electric mobility. So there's some interesting examples coming out of Kenya on that kind of integrated thinking.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tali. We're getting close to time here, but I want to see if Clotilde can answer the question on our take on ride-sharing services and also acceptability of e-mobility where charging infrastructure is not available.
Yes, thank you. So on Uber or similar systems, so we mentioned them briefly in our report, that these are possible mobility as a service kind of models where there is the opportunity to use a shared system, not owned, and this could indeed if electrified, could provide a more approachable way for base of the pyramid to have access to e-mobility, and definitely a more efficient one than the distribution or the ownership of e-car for a very large. So just the shift from regular traffic basically to the green traffic, as Tali mentioned before. So this indeed would be a more efficient utilization of mobility, and could be more sustainable in terms of not having too many cars on the road. In terms of e-mobility, and there are possibility to connect e-mobility with off-grid solar systems, definitely an interesting opportunity. And also there is an opportunity that, as we've seen, for example, in Jordan, where second-hand cars are tapping into the grid or into private homes through a Facebook group where they basically can charge and having their car getting electricity in a very informal way. So indeed, if the sector, the overall boundaries allow for it, there can be very creative solution that can allow for the utilization of electricity.
Okay, I think that's a great example of that energy and transport nexus that needs to be figured out. We're at the end of time for this webinar, but we want to encourage continued dialogue with us. So please do email us at efficiency@SEforALL.org, and be in touch. And if we didn't get to your question, please do send us a note, and we'll look forward to continuing this conversation on energy and transport. And thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you at the SEforALL Forum. Thanks again for your time. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, all.